Before we begin our investigation, tell me in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time on your clock as you start listening. I ask this not as a gesture of engagement, but as a form of record keeping. In cases like the one you are about to hear, patterns rarely reveal themselves in isolation. They emerge only when separate accounts are placed side by side across distance and time and held there long enough to be compared. In the spring of 1924, a federal census register recorded the presence of a family residing at a rural property that, according to county records, had ceased to exist nearly 2 years earlier. The official documentation describing the structure is clear. The house had burned to its foundation during a late summer fire in 1922. The damage was total. The site was declared uninhabitable. The remains were cleared. The parcel was listed as vacant in tax records the following year. And yet, in April of 1924, an enumerator assigned to that district recorded 5 individuals living at that same address. Their names were entered in careful ink. Their ages were noted. Their occupations are listed. The form was signed, certified, and filed without comment. The paperwork is orderly. The sequence is precise. The contradiction is absolute. I first encountered this case while reviewing agricultural census supplements preserved in a regional archive. Documents concerned primarily with livestock counts, land usage classifications, and seasonal yield estimates. The property in question appeared as part of a routine survey of rural holdings. What drew my attention was not the family listed there, but the absence of any structural notation beside the land assessment. The acreage was measured. The soil type was recorded, but the column designated for residential structures was left blank. The land had no house, and yet the population schedule from that same year listed 5 residents at the identical location. At first glance, such discrepancies are not unusual in large administrative systems. Clerical errors, delayed updates, or inconsistent reporting between departments can produce minor contradictions. But the more I examined the surrounding records, the less incidental this inconsistency appeared. The fire that destroyed the property had been thoroughly documented. Insurance files described the event in detail. A sheriff's report recorded the damage. Witness statements confirmed the structure's collapse. Photographs attached to the claim showed nothing remaining beyond a stone foundation and scattered timber. By every official measure, the house no longer existed. To understand how such a contradiction could enter the federal record, we must first examine the conditions of that region during the early 1920s. The property lay several miles beyond the nearest town center, accessible only by an unpaved county road that followed the natural curvature of a narrow valley. Contemporary maps show the surrounding area as sparsely settled farmland, broken by patches of woodland and low marsh. The nearest neighboring residence stood nearly a mile away. Communication relied on irregular postal delivery and occasional travel by wagon or early motor vehicle. It was a place where administrative oversight moved slowly, and where records, once written, often remained unchallenged. The property itself had been established in the 1870s as a modest homestead. Deed transfers show a succession of owners, none remaining longer than a decade. The house, according to a survey conducted in 1910, was a 2-story wooden structure with a narrow front porch and a detached storage building to the rear. The surrounding acreage supported limited farming activity, primarily subsistence crops and small livestock. Nothing in the early records suggests anything unusual about the residence. That changed on the night of August 17, 1922. According to the county fire report, flames were first observed shortly after midnight by a passing farmhand traveling the valley road. By the time assistance arrived, the structure was fully engulfed. The report notes that the fire spread rapidly through the dry timber frame, collapsing the roof and interior supports within an hour. Efforts to salvage the building were abandoned before dawn. By morning, only the stone chimney and sections of foundation remained standing. The cause of the fire was never determined. Witnesses reported no signs of lightning that evening. No evidence of mechanical failure was found among the remains. The official conclusion listed the origin as undetermined, a designation that, in administrative practice, often signifies insufficient evidence rather than absence of cause. More notable than the destruction of the house was the absence of its occupants. Property records indicate that a family had resided there at the time of the fire. Yet the sheriff's investigation reported no confirmed injuries and no recovered remains. Neighbors questioned later stated they had not seen the residents for several days prior to the event. Their departure was neither reported nor explained. The matter received brief attention in local correspondence, then gradually receded from public record. The insurance claim was processed. The land was reassessed. The site was cleared. By the following year, tax documents described the parcel simply as unimproved acreage. The house was gone, which makes the census entry from 1924 difficult to reconcile. The enumerator assigned to the district followed a standard procedure. Surviving field notes show a sequential listing of households along the Valley Road, each entry marked with visit dates and verification signatures. When he reached the parcel where the destroyed house had once stood, he recorded the presence of 5 residents occupying a private dwelling. He noted their relationship to one another. He recorded their years of residence at that location, 2 years. No notation appears beside the entry indicating uncertainty or absence. No correction was filed. The form passed through multiple levels of review before being archived among the permanent population records of the United States. The question is not merely how such an entry was made, but why it was never challenged. Later examination of the enumerator's personal correspondence reveals a brief letter written several months after the census was completed. In it, he refers to a visit to a property in the valley where, as he described it, the records did not align with the ground. The letter offers no elaboration beyond that single sentence. The records did not align with the ground. What he saw there, and what compelled him to record 5 individuals living in a house officially destroyed 2 years earlier, remains unclear. But the documents that follow suggest that the census entry was not an isolated anomaly, but the beginning of a sequence of contradictions that would persist for decades. Because in the years after 1924, additional records began to reference activity at that same vacant property, and none of them acknowledged the absence of a house. The census entry from April of 1924 was not immediately questioned by federal authorities, nor was it reviewed by local officials in the months that followed. At the time, population records were processed in vast quantities, compiled from handwritten schedules collected across thousands of districts. Minor inconsistencies, particularly those involving remote rural properties, often passed without scrutiny unless they affected taxation, inheritance claims, or legal disputes. What makes this case unusual is not that the contradiction existed, but that the contradiction continued. The first additional reference to activity at the property appears in a county agricultural supplement filed in the autumn of 1925. The document records a modest increase in cultivated acreage associated with the parcel, along with a notation describing seasonal planting activity. The handwriting differs from that of the census enumerator, and the report originates from a separate department responsible for assessing land productivity. According to this record, a portion of the previously vacant property had been placed under cultivation during the spring planting season. The crop yield was described as limited but viable. The soil was classified as moderately maintained. The report concludes with a brief remark indicating that the land was actively tended. No mention is made of the structure that had once stood there. No permit for reconstruction was issued. No building application appears in county records from that period. The land was maintained. The house did not exist. At first, this detail might be explained by temporary agricultural use. Abandoned properties are sometimes cultivated by neighboring farmers under informal arrangements, particularly in regions where land lies unused. Yet the agricultural supplement does not list a tenant or adjacent landholder responsible for the activity. The parcel is described as self-managed, a designation typically reserved for resident ownership. To maintain agricultural operations without a residence on site would have required daily travel from elsewhere. Such an arrangement would likely have been noted by neighboring property owners or recorded in lease agreements. No such documentation has been located. More troubling is the pattern that emerges when this agricultural report is examined alongside local postal records. The rural delivery log for the Valley route shows that, beginning in late 1924 and continuing intermittently through 1926, mail was delivered to the same address listed in the census entry. The deliveries were infrequent, consisting primarily of printed circulars, government notices, and at least 3 registered letters requiring acknowledgement of receipt. Each delivery was recorded as completed. The postal carrier assigned to the route at that time left behind a series of handwritten route summaries preserved among municipal records. In one entry dated February 19, 1925, he notes that correspondence addressed to the property had been received by a resident at the lane. No further description appears. The entry is written in the same neutral tone used for every other stop along the route. The lane itself no longer led to a standing structure. A survey map produced the year after the fire shows the road terminating at the remains of the foundation, with no subsequent construction indicated. The postal carrier's notation suggests that someone met him there regularly enough to establish a pattern of delivery. Who received the mail remains unspecified. In 1926, a county tax reassessment introduced another element into the record. The property, previously classified as unimproved land, was revalued to include a residential presence of limited condition. This phrasing appears only once in the county's archival tax language. It does not correspond to standard classifications for occupied dwellings, temporary shelters, or agricultural structures. A residential presence. The phrase is neither descriptive nor explanatory. It suggests occupation without acknowledging construction. To understand how such a classification could enter official documentation, we must consider the procedures governing property assessment at the time. Field assessors were responsible for verifying the physical condition of parcels through direct observation. Their reports typically described structures in measurable terms: number of rooms, building materials, and condition of roof and foundation. The surviving assessment file for this property contains no such details. Instead, the assessor records only that signs of habitation were observed at the site. What those signs consisted of is not specified. The report bears a signature and date. It was accepted without revision. During the same period, regional church records introduce yet another reference. A small parish, serving the surrounding valley, maintained a registry of charitable distributions, documenting assistance provided to local families during periods of economic hardship. Among the entries for the winter of 1926 appears a record indicating that provisions had been delivered to residents of the valley property beyond the eastern marsh. The description corresponds precisely to the location of the burned homestead. The church ledger lists the household as consisting of 5 individuals. The number matches the census entry from 2 years earlier. The provisions delivered included preserved food, blankets, and lamp oil. The notation indicates that the items were received with gratitude. No names are provided. What emerges from these documents is a consistent pattern of institutional recognition. Federal census schedules, agricultural reports, postal deliveries, tax assessments, and church records all acknowledge the presence of residents at a property where no standing residence officially existed. Each record originates from a separate administrative body. Each follows its own procedures for verification. None question the contradiction. It is at this point that witness testimony begins to appear. In 1927, during a routine boundary dispute between neighboring landholders, depositions were taken from residents of the surrounding valley. Among the statements preserved in the case file are several references to activity observed near the site of the former homestead. One neighboring farmer described seeing light moving where no house stood, a remark recorded in the formal language of the deposition without elaboration. Another reported hearing the sound of livestock during early morning hours, though no animals were listed in county agricultural registers for the property. A third statement, provided by a farmhand who regularly traveled the valley road, describes passing the site at dusk and observing smoke rising above the tree line on multiple occasions. The foundation of the house contained no functioning chimney. The court dismissed these accounts as irrelevant to the boundary dispute, and no further investigation was undertaken. The depositions were archived alongside unrelated property documents, where they remained largely unnoticed for decades. By the late 1920s, references to the property begin to decline in frequency. Mail deliveries cease. Agricultural reports omit the parcel entirely. Tax assessments revert to listing the land as unimproved acreage. The record falls silent. For nearly 15 years, no official document acknowledges activity at the site. Then, in 1941, a survey team conducting infrastructure planning for a proposed roadway extension revisited the valley and produced a report that would reintroduce the anomaly into the archival record. Because when the surveyors mapped the parcel where the house had once stood, they documented something that should not have been possible. They recorded a structure. The 1941 roadway survey was not, in itself, unusual. Across much of the country, infrastructure planning accelerated in the early years of the war economy. Counties that had postponed improvements through the Depression began drafting new routes, widening narrow valley roads, and formalizing access for timber, agriculture, and transport. Survey teams were dispatched with standard equipment, instructed to map terrain, mark grades, and document obstacles that could affect construction costs. In the Valley District where the burned homestead had once stood, the surveyors worked from existing county plats that still showed the parcel boundaries but listed no improvements. Their job was to confirm what the maps already indicated, and to produce a clean set of measurements that would support the county's funding request. They expected a vacant foundation and overgrowth. Instead, their report describes a standing structure located precisely where the old homestead had been recorded in earlier deeds. The structure is not described in sentimental terms or in the language of rumor. It is recorded as an obstacle, a physical presence that would require either relocation of the planned roadway or removal of the building. The survey notes classify it as a residential form, set back from the lane by approximately 100 yards. The notation includes a measured footprint, a rough estimate of height, and the location of what appears to have been an outbuilding. A building, not ruins, not a collapsed frame, not a temporary shack, a residential form. What makes this document particularly difficult to dismiss is its method. Surveyors did not rely on hearsay. They measured what they saw because their measurements determined budgets, labor, and approvals. A false structure would not simply be an error. It would be a miscalculation that could derail a proposed project and trigger verification. Yet the survey file contains no follow-up correction. Even more quietly troubling is what the surveyors recorded about the building's condition. They note that the structure appeared occupied or maintained based on signs of recent use. The phrase is not expanded, but similar wording appears elsewhere in the report when describing properties that displayed fresh fencing, cleared paths, or smoke residue consistent with winter heating. In the margin beside the structure's footprint, one surveyor wrote a brief remark in pencil. The inked transcription preserved in the county's official copy retains it as an addendum. No permit record located. That should have been the end of it. A structure without permit history, standing on the site of a known fire loss, would ordinarily trigger immediate questions from the county clerk, the assessor, or the fire marshal. At minimum, it would appear as a discrepancy requiring clarification before any road plan could proceed. Instead, the road plan moved forward in a different direction. The proposed route was adjusted, shifting several hundred yards east along higher ground. The change was justified in the final plan as necessary due to geological instability in low-lying areas. There is no explicit mention of the structure as a reason for the adjustment, but the revised map neatly avoids the parcel altogether, curving around it as if it were simply inconvenient terrain. This is the first moment in the documentary record when the anomaly appears to shape official decisions, not by being confronted, by being avoided. The next relevant document is not a county report, but a private correspondence file dated the following winter. It came from an attorney's office in the nearest town, preserved among estate papers for reasons that were never intended to become public. The letter was written by a man representing a timber company that had acquired harvesting rights on adjacent land. His firm was preparing to clear sections of forest along the valley ridge, and the planned work required access through the old lane. The attorney writes in standard legal language about easements and right-of-way considerations, but then the tone shifts. He notes that his client's men had encountered a residence where no residence was expected, and that the occupants refused to discuss permission for passage. The letter does not describe what the residence looked like. It describes what the men reported feeling when they approached it. They said the air changed near the property line, that the sounds of the forest diminished, that their voices seemed to carry strangely, as if the space around them were shaped differently than it should have been. The attorney includes these remarks not because he believes them, but because they were consistent enough across multiple workers that he felt obligated to document them. He then adds a detail that anchors the letter back into the practical. The workers attempted to approach the residence twice. On both occasions, they observed movement behind the front windows. On both occasions, someone appeared to be watching them, but no one came to the door. The third attempt ended quickly, because one of the workers claimed he saw an interior light extinguish in a way that did not resemble a lamp being turned down or a curtain being closed. He described it instead as though the room had folded back into darkness. The attorney, to his credit, does not endorse the description. He records it, then writes the only sentence that matters in a legal context. We require confirmation of the property's status and lawful occupancy before any further action is attempted. There is no evidence that such confirmation was ever obtained. In the spring of 1942, the timber company petitioned for an alternate access route and received it without delay. The lane near the parcel was left undisturbed. Again, the response is not confrontation, it is rerouting. By this point, the pattern in the record becomes difficult to ignore. Multiple systems acknowledge something at the site, then adjust away from it, rather than resolving the contradiction. The census once listed residents. Later records hinted at cultivation and deliveries. Then the record went silent. Now, a survey team measured a structure, and county planners redirected a road. Timber crews reported occupation, and legal counsel sought clarification that never arrived, followed by another reroute. The absence of resolution begins to feel like a decision. It is around this time that a second set of testimonies emerges, not through courts or county offices, but through the plain habit of people writing down what they saw when they did not know what else to do with it. A local schoolteacher kept a diary through the war years, primarily recording rationing, weather, and the small changes that ripple through rural communities during national crises. Her entry for October 7, 1942, includes a brief mention of walking the Valley Road to deliver books to a student living near the marshland. She writes that she passed the old burned place, then corrects herself mid-sentence and writes, "the place that should be burned," because she saw a roof line through the trees. She describes it as low and dark against the sky, with a shape that resembled the former homestead, but with proportions that made her uneasy. She records that she did not approach because she felt a certainty that she was being watched. That is the language she uses. Not fear, not superstition. Certainty. In a later entry, she notes hearing her student's mother speak of the site as if it were a living thing the valley had learned to step around. The mother, she writes, referred to it simply as that address and advised her never to let curiosity become a habit in a place like this. The diary provides no proof in the way a ledger does, but it does something equally important. It shows that the contradiction had become part of local understanding without ever becoming part of official resolution. People did not argue about whether the structure existed. They argued about whether one should look at it too long. In 1944, another federal count was conducted for wartime manpower and agricultural production. It was not the decennial census, but it required enumerators to update household data in rural districts. The surviving schedules for the Valley route contain a familiar line. The parcel is listed again. A household is recorded again. And beside the entry, in a tighter hand than the rest of the page, the enumerator wrote a single notation that changes the shape of the case entirely. Residents observed, no approach. Instruction received. Instruction received. From whom is not stated. But the implication is unmistakable. Someone with authority, or with influence treated as authority, told the enumerator not to go closer than observation distance. The record acknowledges the house, acknowledges the household, and then acknowledges a directive to limit inquiry. This is the moment the case stops being a mystery of clerical error, and it becomes a mystery of managed containment. Because the question is no longer how a burned house appeared in a census. The question becomes, who knew it would? And who decided that documenting it was acceptable as long as no one asked the wrong questions at the wrong distance? The notation entered by the enumerator in 1944, residents observed, no approach. Instruction received marks a subtle but significant shift in the documentary record. Until that moment, the contradictions surrounding the Valley property could be attributed, at least superficially, to administrative delay, incomplete verification, or the quiet inefficiencies common to rural record-keeping. After that notation, the record suggests something different. It suggests awareness. It suggests that the anomaly was not merely encountered, but anticipated. The Census Office that processed the 1944 schedules followed a structured hierarchy. Enumerators worked under district supervisors who reviewed their field reports before forwarding them to regional offices for compilation. A notation of instruction implies communication within that chain, though no corresponding memorandum has been located among surviving administrative files. The absence of such documentation is itself notable. Federal directives concerning census procedure were typically preserved with precision, especially those involving restricted access or modified field methods. Here, the directive appears only as a single line in a field schedule. No explanation accompanies it. The next available records from the Valley District provide additional evidence that the property's status had become an unspoken matter of shared understanding among local officials. In 1946, the County Health Department conducted a survey of rural sanitation conditions, part of a broader effort to improve public water systems and waste management following wartime population shifts. Inspectors visited each registered household along the Valley Road, documenting well conditions, waste disposal practices, and signs of communicable disease. The report includes a map of inspected sites. The parcel corresponding to the burned homestead appears on the map as a blank space, bordered by a penciled line and labeled simply excluded. No explanation is provided. No inspection results are recorded. The surveyor's route passes within a measurable distance of the site, but does not enter it. This administrative language, precise and restrained, carries implications that extend beyond routine oversight. Public health surveys rarely omitted occupied dwellings without cause. Even abandoned structures were typically documented to ensure they posed no hazard. The decision to exclude a site from inspection suggests either that access was impossible or that access was deliberately avoided. The file does not clarify which. Around the same period, the county assessor's office produced a revised property ledger reflecting post-war valuation adjustments. The entry for the parcel contains a notation that appears nowhere else in the ledger: assessment deferred pending status confirmation. The phrase indicates uncertainty about the property's classification, yet no subsequent confirmation was recorded. For more than a decade, the parcel remained in this suspended administrative condition, neither taxed as improved land nor listed as vacant. A property that existed in the records, yet resisted definition. It is at this stage that the documentary trail begins to intersect more frequently with private correspondence. The individuals writing these accounts were not investigators, nor did they appear to believe they were recording anything of broader significance. Their observations were incidental, preserved only because they were written down for other purposes. One such account comes from a regional telephone installation crew assigned to expand rural service lines in 1947. The crew's work logs, later archived by the utility company, describe attempts to extend service along the valley corridor. The technicians recorded the location of each property offered connection, noting whether residents accepted or declined. At the address corresponding to the valley parcel, the log contains an entry stating, "Line not extended, occupants unresponsive, structure present, access conditions irregular, irregular conditions." The phrase appears again in the margin, accompanied by a brief handwritten note indicating that the crew's equipment experienced interference near the property boundary. The technicians reported that their signal testing instruments produced readings inconsistent with expected field conditions. The anomaly resolved when the crew withdrew to the road. The company's internal review classified the event as equipment malfunction and recommended no further action. The line was routed elsewhere. Once again, systems adjusted around the site. The accumulation of such adjustments, each minor in isolation, begins to form a coherent pattern. Surveyors altered road plans. Inspectors excluded the parcel. Assessors deferred classification. Utility crews rerouted service. Enumerators recorded residents without approach. No single document declares the property unusual. Taken together, the documents reveal a consistent administrative posture. Avoidance without acknowledgement. It is within this atmosphere of quiet containment that the first extended descriptive account of the site appears. The document originates from a forestry officer assigned to conduct a routine inspection of timber growth in the valley watershed during the summer of 1948. His field journal, preserved among state environmental archives, provides a detailed description of the terrain surrounding the parcel and the conditions he encountered while surveying the boundary. He writes that the vegetation near the site differed markedly from that of adjacent land. The trees appeared stunted, their growth patterns irregular. The underbrush was sparse despite favorable soil conditions. He records that the air near the clearing felt unusually still, noting an absence of insect activity and ambient sound. Most striking is his description of the structure itself. He observed a building consistent in outline with earlier descriptions of the homestead, a two-story form with a narrow front aspect and a secondary structure set behind. Yet the materials appeared indistinct, lacking the clear definition of wood or stone. He writes that the surface seemed to absorb light unevenly, producing a visual effect he struggled to describe. At certain angles, the structure appeared fully solid. At others, its edges seemed to recede into the surrounding shadow. He did not approach closer than the perimeter of the clearing. His journal entry concludes with a remark that echoes earlier testimony. Observation produced the impression of occupancy. No visible occupants observed. The Forestry Department did not publish this account. It remained in the officer's personal field journal until its archival deposit decades later. By the close of the 1940s, the valley property had acquired a peculiar status within both official and informal knowledge. The records acknowledged its presence. Local understanding recognized its existence. Yet no authority sought to define its nature or resolve the contradiction that had first appeared in the census 25 years earlier. The anomaly had become stable. It persisted through documentation yet remained untouched by investigation. In 1952, a regional planning commission initiated a comprehensive land use study intended to modernize zoning classifications across several counties. The project required a historical review of property records, including verification of structures destroyed or abandoned in previous decades. Researchers compiling the Valley District's data encountered the fire report from 1922 and the subsequent census entries listing residents at the same address. Their internal memorandum, preserved among Planning Commission archives, raises a question that had not yet been formally articulated: whether the property represented a case of unrecorded reconstruction or whether the census records reflected a systematic reporting error. To resolve the question, the Commission authorized a site verification. A team of 2 inspectors was assigned to visit the parcel, document the physical condition of the land, and reconcile the discrepancy between historical fire records and subsequent evidence of occupation. Their report, filed in November of 1952, is brief. It states that the inspectors reached the boundary of the property, observed a structure consistent with earlier survey descriptions, and determined that conditions at the site made direct examination inadvisable. No further explanation appears. The Commission accepted the report and closed the inquiry. The case might have remained indefinitely within this pattern of observation without resolution, if not for an event that occurred nearly a decade later, an event that introduced into the record the first confirmed interaction between an outsider and the occupants of the house that had burned down. Because in 1961, a delivery driver traveling the valley route reported speaking with someone at the property, and what he described did not resemble any ordinary household. The first documented claim of direct interaction with a resident of the valley property appears in a transportation incident report filed in early November of 1961. The report originates not from law enforcement or county administration, but from a regional freight company whose delivery routes extended through the surrounding rural districts. The driver's statement was recorded as part of a routine explanation for a delayed shipment. What distinguishes the report is not the delay itself, but the location where the delay occurred. According to the driver's account, he had been assigned to deliver agricultural equipment to a farm located several miles beyond the eastern marsh. The route required him to follow the valley road past the parcel where the burned homestead had once stood. He was familiar with the road, having traveled it intermittently for several years, and his statement begins with a practical description of deteriorating road conditions following seasonal rains. He reported that, as he approached the section of road adjacent to the property, his vehicle experienced what he described as mechanical hesitation, a loss of engine response not attributable to fuel or visible malfunction. The engine did not stall entirely, but reduced power in a manner he found difficult to explain. Concerned about becoming stranded, he brought the vehicle to a stop near the entrance to the old lane. The driver then records that he exited the vehicle and observed a house standing at the end of the path. He writes that he had passed the location many times and had never previously seen a structure there. He assumed, at first, that a new residence had been constructed since his last delivery. Yet he also noted that the building's exterior appeared weathered in a way inconsistent with recent construction. The wood showed signs of age. The roofline appeared uneven. The windows reflected no interior detail. Believing he might obtain assistance with his vehicle, he walked partway up the lane. It is here that his account diverges from the routine language of mechanical reporting. He describes a sensation of increasing quiet as he approached, noting that the sound of his own footsteps seemed dampened. He records that the air felt unusually heavy, though he observed no change in weather conditions. When he reached a point approximately 30 yards from the structure, he reports seeing a figure standing behind one of the front windows. The figure did not move. The driver states that he called out, identifying himself and requesting assistance. He reports that the figure remained motionless for several seconds before turning away from the window. A short time later, the front door opened. The individual who emerged, according to the driver's description, was dressed in clothing that appeared outdated in style and construction. He notes the absence of any visible reaction to the delivery vehicle or the surrounding environment. The person spoke in a quiet, deliberate manner, asking the driver what business had brought him to the property. The driver explained his mechanical difficulty and requested permission to use the household's telephone. The resident replied that no telephone was installed. The conversation that follows occupies less than a page of the report, recorded in paraphrased form by the company's claims officer. The driver states that the resident offered no assistance beyond advising him to wait, as the difficulty with the vehicle would resolve in due course. The phrase is recorded verbatim. The resident then returned to the house and closed the door. The driver reports that he waited near his vehicle for approximately 20 minutes, after which the engine resumed normal operation without intervention. He completed his delivery and later filed the incident report as required by company policy. When asked during a follow-up interview whether he had previously known of the house's existence, the driver replied that he had been told by other travelers that the property was not a place for stopping. He had assumed this to be local exaggeration. The freight company filed the report and took no further action. What gives this account particular significance is not merely the claim of interaction, but its consistency with earlier documentary patterns. The presence of a structure, the appearance of occupancy, the absence of modern utilities, the suggestion of a household existing outside the administrative systems that defined surrounding properties. The report circulated quietly among local officials after the company forwarded a copy to the county clerk, concerned about potential road hazards along the route. The clerk's office acknowledged receipt and filed the document without initiating an investigation. The pattern of observation without resolution persisted. 2 years later, in 1963, a regional electric cooperative conducted a survey to expand rural service infrastructure. The cooperative's engineers mapped existing power lines and identified areas lacking connection. The parcel in the valley was again noted. Their survey describes a structure present on the site, yet records no electrical service connection. The engineers attempted to trace any informal wiring that might indicate private generation, but found none. The building, they concluded, appeared to operate without connection to the regional power network. Their report includes a brief remark stating that light was observed within the structure during evening hours, though no source of power could be identified. The cooperative classified the property as non-participating and excluded it from expansion plans. The absence of utilities at an apparently inhabited residence might be explained by alternative power sources or by deliberate refusal of service. Yet no evidence of such arrangements appears in any related record. No fuel deliveries, no generator purchases, no maintenance contracts. The house, if occupied, functioned independently of the systems that sustained the surrounding community. The next significant development occurs in 1968, when a severe storm caused extensive flooding throughout the valley region. Emergency response teams conducted door-to-door welfare checks at affected properties, verifying the safety of residents and documenting structural damage. The response logs for the district include entries for every registered household along the valley road, except one. The parcel corresponding to the burned homestead bears a notation identical to that used decades earlier in the sanitation survey. The emergency response supervisor later recorded in a memorandum that the decision had been made to prioritize accessible locations given limited personnel. He offered no explanation for the exclusion of a property listed as occupied in earlier surveys. The memorandum concludes with a statement that the site presented conditions unsuitable for standard response procedures. The language is administrative, precise, and entirely opaque. By the end of the 1960s, the valley property had acquired a peculiar administrative identity. It was neither abandoned nor officially recognized as an active residence. It existed in records as a location of intermittent observation, subject to documentation yet exempt from intervention. The next decade introduces a development that deepens the anomaly further. In 1974, a regional university initiated an oral history project documenting rural life and settlement patterns in the Valley District. Researchers conducted interviews with long-term residents, recording their recollections of local history, agricultural practices, and community changes across generations. Several interviewees referred, without prompting, to the property beyond the eastern marsh. Their descriptions varied in detail but converged in a single assertion. They believed the family recorded in the census of 1924 had never left. The oral history interviews conducted in 1974 were intended to document agricultural practices and settlement patterns, not to investigate anomalies. Yet among the recordings preserved in the university archives, the references to the valley property appear with striking consistency. They emerge in response to unrelated questions, inserted into recollections of seasonal work, road conditions, and family histories, as though the presence of that place formed an unspoken constant within the region's shared memory. One interview subject, a farmer who had lived along the western ridge since childhood, described the property as a house that minds its own affairs. When asked what he meant, he clarified that the household associated with the site did not participate in ordinary exchanges. They did not attend church services. They did not purchase supplies in town. They did not appear at public gatherings. Yet, according to his recollection, they were occasionally seen at a distance, moving within the boundaries of the land. Another interviewee, a former schoolteacher, recalled childhood warnings not to approach the lane leading toward the property. She described these warnings not as expressions of fear, but as practical guidance delivered with unusual seriousness. Children, she explained, were told that the residents valued their privacy and that disturbance would not be welcomed. When the interviewer asked whether she had ever personally encountered anyone from the household, she hesitated before answering. She stated that once, during a walk with her father in the late 1930s, she had seen a woman standing near the tree line at the edge of the property. The figure appeared to observe them without expression. When she asked her father who the woman was, he instructed her to continue walking and not to look back. The interview transcript records no further elaboration. A third account comes from a retired postal employee who had served in the district during the 1950s. He stated that although the property had no registered mailbox, he had occasionally found letters addressed to the location placed among routine deliveries. The addresses were written in careful script, often lacking specific names. They referred simply to the household or to the family by designation rather than individual identity. The postal employee explained that such letters could not be delivered through ordinary channels. They bore no forwarding information, no confirmed recipients. Following standard procedure, he returned them to the regional sorting office, where they were classified as undeliverable. He added, however, that on several occasions he noticed the letters had been removed from the return bin before processing could be completed. The removal was never formally investigated. What emerges from these interviews is not a portrait of dramatic encounter, but a pattern of quiet acknowledgement. The household was treated neither as a legend nor as an ordinary residence. It occupied a category that required no explanation because it had always existed at the margins of explanation. This collective understanding extended into practical behavior. Farmers adjusted field boundaries to avoid trespassing near the property. Road maintenance crews noted the lane, but rarely worked beyond its entrance. Utility surveys recorded the location, yet excluded it from service expansion. The property existed, and therefore it was accommodated, but it was not integrated. The Oral History Project's principal investigator addressed this pattern in a summary report prepared in 1975. He observed that communities sometimes develop what he termed administrative silence, a shared practice of non-engagement with phenomena perceived as disruptive to social order. In such cases, the absence of formal explanation becomes itself a stabilizing mechanism. The investigator did not attempt to verify the claims concerning the valley property. He noted them as cultural artifacts, expressions of local identity rather than factual assertions. Yet he also acknowledged that the consistency of the accounts presented an unusual case. They describe not a single event, but a continuous presence. While the oral history research proceeded, an unrelated development introduced new documentary material into the record. In 1976, the State Land Registry initiated a comprehensive review of property boundaries within the Valley District as part of a broader taxation reform. Surveyors re-examined historical deeds, updated parcel maps, and attempted to reconcile discrepancies that had accumulated over decades. During this process, they encountered a persistent irregularity concerning the parcel corresponding to the burned homestead. The land had been recorded as vacant since the early 20th century. Yet successive surveys included annotations indicating physical structures present on the site at various intervals. These annotations were not accompanied by permits, construction records, or ownership transfers. The surveyors attempted to determine whether unauthorized building had occurred. Their field report describes a visit to the property during which they observed a residence consistent with earlier descriptions. A two-story structure positioned near the center of the parcel, weathered in appearance, with no visible connection to surrounding infrastructure. The surveyors noted that the building's orientation did not align with the foundation recorded in the fire investigation of 1907. The house, in other words, did not occupy the documented footprint of the original structure. This detail required explanation. Unauthorized reconstruction typically followed existing foundations to minimize labor. A structure erected elsewhere on the parcel would necessitate deliberate planning and substantial effort. No record of such activity existed. The surveyors attempted to identify occupants to determine ownership responsibility. According to their report, they approached the property during daylight hours and called out from the boundary. Receiving no response, they recorded the site as occupied, ownership undetermined, and referred the matter to the registry's legal division. The legal division reviewed the case and concluded that without identifiable owners or claimants, enforcement action could not proceed. The parcel remained listed as vacant for taxation purposes. Thus, the records produced a paradox. A property recorded as unoccupied contained a structure observed by multiple officials. A residence without ownership existed within a legal framework that required ownership for recognition. The survey report closes with a statement that further action was deferred pending clarification of title. No clarification followed. In the years that followed, references to the property continued to appear sporadically in administrative documents, each reinforcing the same contradiction: observations of a dwelling, indications of presence, absence of legal identity. By the late 1970s, the anomaly had persisted for more than half a century. The next significant development occurs in 1982, when a private researcher examining regional demographic patterns identified a detail that would reframe the entire sequence of events. The detail concerned the census record of 1924. Specifically, it concerned the individuals listed as residents of the burned house. The demographic review, conducted in 1982, was not initially concerned with anomalies in property records. The researcher responsible for the study was examining patterns of population stability in rural districts, comparing census data across successive decades to identify migration trends, household composition, and regional decline. The work involved systematic comparison of names, ages, and familial relationships recorded in official enumerations. It was during this comparison that the irregularity emerged. The census entry from 1924, listing a household at the Valley property, included 4 individuals described as members of a single-family unit. Their ages were recorded with specificity. Their occupations were listed in conventional terms. Their place of residence was clearly identified. When the researcher cross-referenced these individuals with earlier census data, he discovered that the same names appeared in the enumeration of 1914. At first glance, such continuity would not be unusual. Families frequently remained in one location across decades, yet a closer examination revealed a detail that could not be reconciled with ordinary demographic patterns. The ages recorded for the individuals in 1924 were identical to those listed 10 years earlier. No adjustment had been made for the passage of time. A man recorded as 42 years old in 1914 remained 42 in 1924. A woman listed as 38 remained 38. The ages of the 2 children were likewise unchanged. The researcher initially suspected clerical duplication. Census records were occasionally transcribed inaccurately, particularly in rural districts where enumerators relied on handwritten notes later transferred into official registers. A simple copying error might explain the anomaly. Yet the rest of the census page showed no signs of duplication. Neighboring households were recorded with updated ages and revised family compositions. Births, deaths, and relocations were accurately reflected. Only the household associated with the Valley property displayed the static data. The researcher expanded his review to include the census of 1934. The same family appeared again. Once more, the ages remained unchanged. The implication was extraordinary. Across 2 decades of enumeration, the household's demographic profile exhibited no alteration, no aging, no births, no deaths, no departures. The family existed in the records as a fixed entity. The researcher documented his findings in a memorandum submitted to the State Demographic Office. The memorandum framed the anomaly cautiously, presenting the evidence as a possible case of administrative inertia. He suggested that enumerators may have relied on earlier records when direct verification proved difficult, reproducing outdated information rather than confirming current conditions. The Demographic Office acknowledged receipt of the memorandum but took no immediate action. However, the existence of the discrepancy prompted a limited review of enumeration procedures in the district. Supervisors examined field notes from the census operations of 1924 and 1934 to determine how the data had been collected. What they found deepened the anomaly. The field notes from 1924 include a brief entry indicating that the enumerator had approached the valley property and confirmed the household's presence through direct observation. The note describes a dwelling occupied by a family matching the recorded names. The enumerator records that the information was obtained through conversation with an adult member of the household. The handwriting is steady. The language is routine. There is no indication of uncertainty. The field notes from 1934 contain a similar entry. A different enumerator reports visiting the property and verifying the household composition. Once again, the information is described as obtained directly from the occupants. The ages recorded match those of the earlier census. The Demographic Office faced a contradiction. If the enumerators had relied solely on prior records, their field notes would reflect indirect reporting. Instead, the notes assert personal contact. To resolve the discrepancy, officials attempted to locate the enumerators responsible for the entries. One had died several years earlier. The other, then retired, agreed to provide a statement. His testimony survives in the Demographic Office archives. He recalled visiting the valley property during the enumeration of 1934. He described the house as difficult to approach due to deteriorating road conditions, but confirmed that he had spoken with a resident who provided the household information. When asked whether he had noticed anything unusual about the occupants, he responded that their manner was reserved but not remarkable. He acknowledged, however, that he had experienced difficulty confirming their ages. The individuals, he stated, appeared consistent with the information provided, and he had no basis to dispute the figures. The statement ends with a remark that the enumerator had found the visit disquieting, though he could not specify why. The Demographic Office concluded that the matter did not warrant further investigation. Census data, they reasoned, reflected self-reported information subject to error. Without evidence of fraud or administrative misconduct, the anomaly remained a statistical curiosity. The memorandum was filed, yet the researcher who first identified the irregularity continued his examination independently. He sought to determine whether the individuals listed in the Valley household appeared in other records, birth registries, marriage licenses, employment rolls, or death certificates. They did not. The names existed only within the census entries and the earlier enumeration records from the same location. No evidence placed them elsewhere in the administrative system. No documentation recorded their arrival in the district. No record marked their departure. They were present in the census and absent everywhere else. The researcher extended his review further, examining property tax records, school enrollment lists, and public health registries. The absence persisted. No tax payments were attributed to the household. No children bearing the family name appeared in school registers. No medical or legal documentation referenced the individuals. The household was administratively contained within a single category of record. It existed in the census. This discovery transformed the meaning of the earlier observations. The reports of a house appearing where none should stand, the absence of utilities, the exclusion from surveys, and the silence of administrative systems all converged with the demographic anomaly. The Valley property did not merely resist documentation. It generated documentation that contradicted itself. The researcher prepared a detailed report summarizing his findings and submitted it to a regional historical journal. The paper was reviewed, but ultimately declined for publication. The editors cited insufficient evidence to support conclusions beyond clerical irregularity. The report remained in the researcher's personal archive until his death, after which it was donated to a university collection. The implications of the demographic anomaly would have remained confined to academic curiosity had it not been for a subsequent discovery made nearly a decade later. The discovery occurred during the cataloging of photographic materials recovered from a private estate. Among the images was a photograph of a family standing before a house that, according to official records, had ceased to exist decades earlier. The photograph entered the historical record in 1991 as part of a private estate donation to a regional archive. The materials had belonged to a collector of early 20th century rural photography whose holdings consisted primarily of landscape images, family portraits, and architectural studies documenting vanishing settlements. The collection contained no accompanying catalog beyond a series of handwritten labels indicating approximate dates and locations. Among the photographs, preserved in a sealed portfolio, was an image that would later become central to the investigation of the Valley property. The photograph depicts a two-story wooden house situated on a rise of land bordered by sparse trees and open ground. The structure appears weathered but intact. Its architectural details, window placement, roofline, and exterior siding correspond closely with descriptions recorded in earlier administrative surveys of the Valley parcel. Standing before the house are four individuals arranged in a formal composition typical of domestic portraiture from the early 20th century. A man and woman occupy the central position. Two younger figures stand slightly apart, positioned with deliberate symmetry. Their expressions are restrained. Their posture suggests the stillness required by long exposure photography. What gives the image its particular significance is the notation written on the reverse. The label identifies the photograph as taken in 1941. This date alone would not necessarily have drawn attention. Rural properties often persisted beyond official documentation, and errors in labeling were not uncommon in private collections. Yet when the photograph was compared with earlier census records and demographic reports, the implication became clear. The individuals depicted in the image appeared identical to the family listed in the census of 1924. The apparent ages of the subjects corresponded not with the passage of 17 years, but with the original enumeration. The adult figures showed no visible signs of aging. The younger figures appeared unchanged. The photograph was submitted for forensic examination to determine whether the image might have been misdated or altered. The analysis concluded that the photographic materials were consistent with production techniques used in the early 1940s. The paper stock, chemical composition, and development process matched the period indicated. No evidence of manipulation was detected. The archivist, responsible for cataloging the collection, prepared a report describing the image and its relation to the Valley property. He noted the correspondence between the architectural features of the house in the photograph and those described in survey documents from the 1960s and 70s. He also observed that the individuals depicted matched the census descriptions in number and apparent age. The report was circulated among regional historians and administrative offices. The response was limited. Officials acknowledged the photograph as an artifact of uncertain provenance. Without corroborating documentation establishing the identities of the subjects or the precise location of the image, they regarded it as insufficient evidence to revise existing records. The photograph was cataloged and stored. Yet its existence introduced a new dimension to the accumulated pattern. The anomaly was no longer confined to administrative records or oral testimony. It appeared in visual documentation, produced independently of census enumeration or survey observation. The house that had burned in 1907 appeared standing in 1941. The family recorded as residing there in 1924 appeared unchanged. The implications extended beyond questions of clerical error or administrative oversight. The records did not merely contradict one another. They described a continuity of presence that resisted temporal progression. Following the discovery of the photograph, a small group of researchers undertook a systematic review of regional archives to determine whether additional visual evidence existed. Their search yielded several references to the Valley property in unrelated collections, landscape studies, aerial surveys, and amateur photographic journals, but no images depicting the household itself. One aerial survey conducted in 1953 captured the Valley District in detail. The survey images show the parcel corresponding to the burned homestead as partially obscured by vegetation. The resolution is insufficient to confirm the presence of a structure, though a rectangular shadow consistent with a building appears in the approximate location. The survey report does not mention the property. Another photographic reference appears in a travel diary from 1958. The diary's author, an amateur photographer documenting rural architecture, recorded a brief entry describing a residence beyond the eastern marsh, unmarked and curiously silent. The entry includes no image, only a written description of a house, observed from a distance. The author notes that he was unable to approach the property due to deteriorating road conditions. These fragments, though inconclusive individually, reinforce the broader pattern of intermittent visibility. The property appeared in observation, receded from documentation, and re-emerged in isolated records. The most significant development following the photograph's discovery occurred in 1994, when a state commission initiated a review of irregular census entries across multiple districts. The review was part of a broader effort to digitize historical records and correct discrepancies identified during data conversion. During this process, the Valley household records from 1914, 1924, and 1934 were re-examined. Digital comparison confirmed what earlier researchers had observed. The household data remained unchanged across decades. The names, ages, and relationships were identical in each enumeration. No annotation explained the continuity. The commission attempted to reconcile the entries with property records and population registries. As before, the household appeared nowhere outside the census. The commission's final report categorized the case as an unresolved archival anomaly. It recommended no corrective action, noting that historical census data reflected conditions reported at the time of enumeration and could not be revised without substantiating evidence. The record remained. What distinguishes this phase of the investigation is the convergence of three independent forms of documentation: administrative records, oral testimony, and visual evidence all describe a household occupying a property that official fire reports declared destroyed. Each form of evidence reinforces the others, while resisting integration into a coherent explanation. The house is observed, yet unregistered. The occupants are recorded, yet absent from civic life. The structure appears in photographs, yet lacks a documented origin. By the mid-1990s, the Valley property had acquired a peculiar status within regional historiography. It was recognized not as a legend, but as a documented inconsistency within the archival record. Researchers could not confirm its existence in conventional terms. They could not dismiss its presence in the evidence. The next development would introduce a final element to the pattern, one that would connect the property's administrative anomaly to a broader sequence of events extending beyond the valley itself. The element emerged from a review of fire insurance records dating back to the early 20th century. The review of fire insurance records began as a routine component of the State Commission's broader examination of early 20th century administrative documentation. Insurance ledgers from the period were being digitized and indexed, primarily to preserve historical data concerning property valuation, loss claims, and regional development patterns. These records, maintained with considerable precision, often provided details absent from municipal archives. It was within this process that investigators encountered a series of entries associated with the Valley parcel. The initial ledger entry corresponds to the fire reported in 1907. The record describes a total structural loss, confirming the destruction of a residential dwelling by accidental ignition. The cause is listed as undetermined. The claim was processed, compensation was issued to the property owner, and the structure was recorded as removed from insured inventory. The documentation appears complete. Yet subsequent entries complicate this account. In 1912, a notation appears referencing an inspection request for a residential structure located on the same parcel. The request originated from an insurance assessor conducting a regional survey of properties eligible for coverage. The ledger indicates that the assessor recorded the presence of a standing dwelling at the site. The inspection was not completed. A marginal note explains that the structure could not be evaluated due to restricted access and uncooperative occupants. The entry concludes without further action. This notation might be interpreted as a clerical misidentification or a simple error in parcel numbering or geographic description. However, additional entries reinforce the irregularity. In 1923, the ledger records a second attempt to assess the property for insurance eligibility. Once again, the assessor reported the existence of a dwelling at the location. The entry states that the structure appeared occupied, but that the occupants declined to provide information necessary for coverage. The inspection was terminated. A third entry dated 1931 documents a similar attempt. The assessor noted a residence consistent with prior descriptions, but recorded that the property remained uninsured due to the inability to obtain documentation of ownership or construction. Across these entries, a pattern emerges. Insurance assessors repeatedly reported a standing structure on a parcel where official records indicated none should exist. The structure was observed, yet it could not be integrated into the administrative framework governing property registration and valuation. The implications extend beyond simple inconsistency. Fire insurance records were maintained for financial accountability. Insurers relied on accurate documentation to manage risk and liability. The persistence of entries acknowledging a structure at the Valley site indicates that multiple independent observers confirmed its presence over several decades. The commission reviewing the insurance ledgers sought to reconcile these entries with municipal property records. As in earlier investigations, no permit authorizing reconstruction of the burned dwelling was found. No deed recorded the transfer of a new structure. No tax assessment reflected an improved property value. Administratively, the house did not exist. Physically, according to the assessor's reports, it did. The review uncovered an additional detail of particular significance. The 1931 ledger entry includes a brief description of the occupant's refusal to participate in the assessment process. The assessor recorded that communication with the residents was formal but limited, and that they provided no identifying information beyond confirming their residence at the location. The description of the household's composition, 2 adults and 2 younger individuals, correspond precisely with the census entries documented earlier. This convergence of demographic and insurance records establishes a continuity of observation across separate administrative systems. Census enumerators recorded the household's presence. Insurance assessors confirmed a dwelling and occupants. Surveyors noted structural outlines. Yet no system succeeded in incorporating the property into its regulatory framework. The house remained visible, yet unregistered. The Commission's final analysis considered the possibility of deliberate evasion. It proposed that the occupants may have intentionally avoided official documentation, declining to register the property or participate in administrative procedures. Such behavior, while unusual, would not be unprecedented in isolated rural communities. However, this explanation fails to account for a central inconsistency. If the structure had been rebuilt following the fire, some evidence of construction would be expected. Materials purchased, labor contracted, permits filed, or land records amended. The complete absence of such documentation suggests that no recognized process of reconstruction occurred. The dwelling appeared without administrative origin. Further examination of the insurance archives revealed one additional anomaly. In 1942, the ledger contains a final reference to the Valley parcel. The entry records a notation by an assessor who reported that the property could no longer be located. The structure observed in previous inspections was not present. The parcel appeared vacant, overgrown, and without signs of habitation. No explanation accompanies the entry. The record concludes with a simple annotation: property inactive. This sequence of observations, presence documented repeatedly over decades, followed by abrupt absence, mirrors patterns observed in other aspects of the investigation. The property emerges within the record, persists for a period of time, then recedes without formal acknowledgement of change. The Commission's report, completed in 1996, addressed the fire insurance anomaly in cautious terms. It acknowledged the contradiction between official records of structural destruction and subsequent observations of a dwelling. It noted the absence of evidence supporting reconstruction. It recognized the convergence of census, survey, and insurance documentation. The report offered no definitive conclusion. Instead, it categorized the Valley property as an instance of persistent administrative discrepancy, a phrase indicating a condition in which available records cannot be reconciled within established explanatory frameworks. The classification effectively closed the matter, yet one final discovery would challenge even this limited conclusion. During the digitization of land registry archives in the early 21st century, archivists identified a series of marginal annotations attached to historical property maps of the Valley District. These annotations, overlooked in earlier reviews, suggest that the anomaly associated with the burned house may not have been confined to a single parcel of land. They indicate the presence of a pattern extending across multiple locations. The marginal annotations discovered in the land registry archives were not part of the official property descriptions. They appeared in faint pencil along the edges of survey maps dating from the early decades of the 20th century. The markings were inconsistent in style and likely added at different times by different hands. Yet they shared a common function. Each indicated parcels where structures had been observed without corresponding documentation of construction or ownership. The Valley property was among those marked. What distinguishes these annotations is their chronological distribution. The earliest appear in maps produced shortly after the fire recorded in 1907. Later maps from the 1920s and 1930s include additional notations, identifying other locations where surveyors reported discrepancies between physical observation and administrative record. In each instance, the language is restrained and procedural. Terms such as structure noted, occupancy indicated, and verification pending appear beside parcels lacking recorded improvements. The annotations rarely elaborate. They identify anomalies without attempting an explanation. A review of these marked parcels reveals a pattern of geographic distribution. The sites cluster along routes associated with early settlement corridors, regions characterized by sparse oversight and limited administrative infrastructure during the period in question. Many of the parcels correspond to locations where population records show irregularities, with households appearing briefly in census data and then vanishing from subsequent enumeration. The Valley property is the most thoroughly documented example of this phenomenon, but the annotations suggest it was not unique. The archivists who identified the markings prepared a report summarizing their findings. They noted that the annotations were not incorporated into official revisions of the maps. They remained marginal, informal observations preserved only because the maps themselves were retained. The report proposed that surveyors encountering unexplained structures may have recorded them privately rather than initiating a formal investigation, particularly in regions where administrative resources were limited. Such practices would account for the absence of corresponding entries in official registers. Yet the report also acknowledged that the annotations raise questions about the reliability of the administrative boundary between documented and undocumented habitation. If structures could be observed repeatedly without entering the formal record, the distinction between presence and absence becomes uncertain. The archivists attempted to trace the subsequent history of several marked parcels. In most cases, the sites eventually appear in later maps as vacant land. No explanation is provided for the disappearance of the structures previously noted. The Valley parcel follows the same trajectory. By the mid-20th century, survey maps depict the property as unoccupied woodland. The marginal notation identifying a structure remains visible but unaddressed. This sequence mirrors the pattern documented in other sources. The house appears in observation, persists across multiple administrative systems, then vanishes without formal acknowledgement. The accumulation of evidence permits a limited reconstruction. A dwelling destroyed by fire in the early 20th century was later reported standing by census enumerators, surveyors, and insurance assessors. A household associated with the property was recorded repeatedly in demographic data, exhibiting no change in composition or age across decades. Photographic evidence depicts the structure and its occupants long after the date of destruction. Administrative systems acknowledged the anomaly but did not resolve it. The property ultimately returned to a state of apparent vacancy. These facts constitute the documented record. A conventional explanation remains possible: clerical error, misidentification of parcels, duplication of records, and failures of communication among administrative offices could account for individual discrepancies. The persistence of anomalies across multiple systems might reflect the cumulative effect of such errors. Yet certain details resist this interpretation. The consistency of observation by independent officials, the absence of evidence supporting reconstruction, the demographic continuity recorded over decades, and the eventual disappearance of the structure without documented cause form a pattern that cannot be fully reconciled through ordinary administrative failure. The record contains both order and contradiction. In the years following the discovery of the marginal annotations, the Valley property attracted limited scholarly attention. Researchers cited the case as an example of the instability of historical documentation, illustrating the challenges of reconstructing past realities from incomplete archives. No formal investigation has been undertaken in recent decades. The site itself remains largely unchanged. The land is privately owned, densely wooded, and rarely visited. No visible trace of the dwelling reported in earlier records has been confirmed. The terrain bears no obvious indication of prior habitation beyond subtle irregularities in the soil that might, under certain conditions, suggest the outline of a foundation. These physical remnants, however, are ambiguous. What persists with greater clarity is the documentary trace. The census entries remain preserved in national archives. The insurance ledgers, survey reports, and photographic materials continue to exist as artifacts of administrative observation. The marginal annotations on property maps endure as quiet acknowledgments of unresolved discrepancies. Taken together, they form a sequence of records describing a phenomenon that cannot be fully explained within the framework of established procedure. The significance of this case does not rest solely in the question of whether a house stood where records declared none should exist. Its importance lies in the broader implications concerning the relationship between documentation and reality. Administrative systems are designed to impose order upon the physical world, to record, classify, and regulate the conditions of habitation. When such systems produce contradictions that persist across decades, they reveal the limits of their authority. The Valley property illustrates this limitation. A structure recorded as destroyed reappears in observation. A household absent from civic life persists in demographic enumeration. Official records affirm absence while independent documentation asserts presence. The contradiction remains unresolved. As with many archival anomalies, the case concludes not with a definitive explanation, but with a set of enduring questions. What constitutes evidence of existence when documentation conflicts with observation? How do administrative systems respond when the facts they record cannot be reconciled? At what point does the absence of explanation become itself a form of record? The documents provide no answers. They preserve only the sequence of events and the responses of those who encountered them, surveyors noting structures that should not exist, enumerators recording households that did not age, assessors observing dwellings without origin, and archivists discovering patterns without resolution. The burned house in the valley stands as a convergence of these observations, a focal point where administrative certainty gives way to uncertainty. The final entry in the Commission's report from 1996 summarizes the case in a single sentence. The property, it states, remains an unresolved discrepancy within the historical record. Nothing further was added. The records were filed. The archives were sealed. The maps were returned to storage. What remains is the pattern, a sequence of documented contradictions preserved across generations, an account of presence and absence existing simultaneously within the official memory of a place. If you value investigations that reconstruct forgotten histories from the fragments left behind, consider subscribing to the channel so these documented patterns and the questions they raise are not lost to silence.